The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of industrial insects. The cafeteria at Mercy General fell into its usual Thursday rhythm, the clink of plastic trays, the hiss of the espresso machine in the corner, the low murmur of doctors and nurses discussing their shifts in clusters of white coats and blue scrubs. Rain hammered the windows facing the parking lot, each drop striking the glass like a tiny fist demanding entry. Nobody noticed the woman in the corner, moving through the line with the economy of motion that comes from years of existing in spaces where attention is a liability. Danielle Ross had been at Mercy General for exactly 3 months and 7 days. She could have told you the precise hour, 5:36 a.m. on a Monday in late September when she'd walked through the ER doors for the first time, her credentials in one hand and a cardboard box of personal items in the other. Not the kind of cardboard box you want to carry into a new job. The kind that whispers about starting over. She'd chosen Raleigh the way other people choose lottery numbers, completely at random, far enough from the coast to make recognition unlikely, small enough that a woman could disappear into the machinery of a mid-sized hospital without anyone asking her name. The navy scrubs helped. They made her one of dozens of identically dressed bodies moving through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and desperation. She didn't make eye contact in the elevators. Didn't linger at the nurses' station where the real gossip happened. Didn't join the cluster of RNs who gathered after shift to complain about attending physicians and insurance companies. Danielle Ross was the kind of invisible that takes discipline to maintain. At 51 years old, she had earned the right to be forgettable. The tray she'd assembled held a sandwich she wouldn't finish, a cup of black coffee, and a small container of soup that steamed and released its salt smell into the recycled hospital air. She moved toward a table at the far edge of the cafeteria, the kind of positioning that let her see the entire room. Habit. Old habits never really leave the body. They just find new homes in new uniforms. The boots were in her locker downstairs. Brown leather, scuffed at the heel, the laces knotted twice because the regular knots never held. She'd carried them to work every day for 3 months in a gym bag she'd bought from a thrift store on Fayetteville Street. She didn't know why. She told herself it was practical, or backup shoes for emergencies. The truth was something else. The truth had calluses and a rank sewn into the inside collar that she'd never quite had the courage to cut out. "Gentlemen, I have $20 that says she walks within 7 days." The voice cut across the cafeteria like a surgical instrument. Precise. Clean. Confident. Dr. Marcus Sterling stood near the beverage station in the charcoal suit that probably cost more than Danielle's monthly rent, his tie knotted in that particular way that said he'd gone to the right schools and belonged to the right clubs. He was flanked by 2 other attending physicians, Dr. Hayes and Dr. Conrad, the kind of men who laughed when Sterling spoke because laughter was a form of currency in hierarchies like this. Sterling was holding court the way some men hold court, with the casual authority of someone who'd never once had to question whether the room would listen. 2 weeks, Dr. Hayes countered. "I'm saying 2 weeks. She'll crack faster than that." 10 days, Dr. Conrad offered. "She's got the look of someone running from something. They always crack faster." Danielle's hand stopped midway to her mouth. The sandwich remained suspended. She didn't look up. Her coffee cup was more interesting than it had been 30 seconds ago. The pattern of steam rising. The way the black surface reflected the overhead lights. These were the kinds of small details you focused on when you were practicing being invisible. When you were practicing being anything but a woman whose ears had just received information her hands wanted to throw back at them. 1 measured breath. That's what she did. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of breathing they'd taught her in combat medicine training, the kind that kept you steady when every nerve ending was singing with adrenaline and the urge to respond. Sterling didn't see her. Neither did his colleagues. This was the thing about being invisible, the men with power never looked twice at the equipment they assumed would break under pressure. She kept her hand steady on the tray. Kept her jaw level. Kept her eyes on that coffee cup as if it contained the secret to surviving another 3 months in a building where she was apparently the subject of wages. The rain outside drummed a rhythm against the windows, and somewhere in the mechanical hum of the hospital's ventilation system, she could hear the echo of another place. Another time. Helmand Province. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through desert air. The weight of a child's arm around her neck as dust settled on everything. She didn't tremble. That was the discipline talking. 20 years of discipline taught in combat zones, reinforced in the quiet of her apartment where she sat at 2 a.m. and watched the rain and tried to convince herself that starting over was possible if you just kept your head down long enough. The door to the cafeteria opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of the parking lot, wet asphalt, diesel from the ambulance bay, the electric smell of ozone that comes after a storm. Danielle's eyes lifted slightly, automatically scanning for exits and threats. Muscle memory. It never really checked out. This was going to be a problem. 38 minutes later, Danielle was moving through the trauma bay, the controlled chaos of a Thursday afternoon when the ER filled with the usual collection of car accidents and chest pain and overdoses. She was adjusting the fall line on an 84-year-old woman with acute CHF, her movements economical and practiced, when she heard Sterling's voice again. Ross. My office. Now. It wasn't a request. The tone made that clear. She finished taping the fall line, clean work, the kind that would hold for hours, and handed the patient's chart to the RN she'd been assisting. A young woman named Michelle who'd started 3 weeks ago and still had that quality of being overwhelmed by the volume of suffering in the ER. Danielle had caught her in the supply room on day 2, crying quietly into a box of latex gloves, and had sat beside her without speaking until the crying stopped. The walk to Sterling's office took her through the main hallway, past the central monitoring station where nurses watched the rhythms of 36 patients on a wall of screens, each one a story of someone's worst day. Sterling's office was on the administrative floor, corner windows, the kind of view that told you which side of the institution's power structure you stood on. He was waiting at his desk when she entered. Not sitting. Standing. Positioned in that power stance, feet planted, chest forward, the posture of a man accustomed to dominance. On his desk were 3 stacks of papers. He'd been ready for this conversation for a while, she realized. This wasn't spontaneous. This was choreography. I've noticed you read our charts thoroughly, Sterling said. No preamble. No sit down, Borf, how are you settling in? Just a statement that landed like a test. Danielle waited. The skill she'd learned in 3 months at Mercy General was the skill of not filling silence with words. Sterling needed words. Men like him did. You took an interest in our supply contracts yesterday. The billing on the surgical care solutions arrangement. Her eyes didn't move from his face. She'd read those charts. One of the sutures vendor showed costs that didn't align with market rates. The difference was small enough to be invisible to someone doing quick spot checks. The kind of difference you only noticed if you actually read the contracts. She'd actually read the contracts. It was an anomaly, she said. I was checking. You were checking. Sterling's smile was the smile of a man who'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. That's the problem with hiring nurses who actually pay attention. Curiosity is a liability. The first humiliation had been casual. A bet. Boys' club conversation with money and wages attached. This was different. This was him laying out the chessboard. Showing her exactly how much he'd calculated her presence as a threat. Danielle's shoulders didn't tense. Her breath remained steady. But something shifted behind her eyes, a focusing, the way a lens adjusts to capture something distant and makes it suddenly sharp. I don't have a problem with you, Sterling continued, moving around his desk. I have a problem with nurses who create problems. Nurses who ask questions. Nurses who think they understand hospital administration better than people trained for it. He stopped in front of her. Not close enough to be a physical threat. Close enough to establish dominance. The power dynamic he was trying to create depended on her being small. On her accepting the smallness he was offering. She stood motionless. You seem like a good nurse, he said. Quiet. Competent. The kind of person the ER doesn't have enough of. But that's exactly the kind of person who becomes a problem when she develops an interest in things above her pay grade. So here's what's going to happen. He walked back to his desk, settled into his chair like a king settling onto a throne. And Danielle understood, in that moment, that she had just been marked. Not for what she'd done. For what she might become. For what she might see if she kept looking. The cardboard box was waiting in her locker at the end of the shift. She didn't know how it got there. She found it when she was retrieving her coat, a box approximately 8 inches by 12 inches, placed carefully on the upper shelf, her name written on the side in block letters. No return address. No postage. Hand-delivered. Personal. She opened it in the privacy of her car in the parking lot, the rain still falling, the windshield fogging with the warmth of her breath. Inside was a single object. A pair of combat boots. Her combat boots. The one she'd left behind when she'd walked away. The one she'd assumed were gone forever, lost to the machinery of the military bureaucracy, filed away in some storage facility, transformed into property of the United States government. But here they were. In her hands. In Raleigh, North Carolina. At a hospital nobody should know she worked at. The leather was exactly as she remembered. The laces still knotted twice. The right boot still bore the scuff where a piece of shrapnel had caught her during her last tour. The inside still had that smell, old sweat and desert dust and the ghost of a woman who hadn't needed to be invisible. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of holding down everything that wanted to surface when she touched something she'd spent 3 months trying to convince herself didn't matter anymore. She started the car. Drove to the place she'd rented, a 2-bedroom on the edge of town where the neighbors kept to themselves and the landlord didn't ask questions. She sat in the driveway for 45 minutes with the engine running and the boots in her lap, her eyes on the dark windows of her silent house, the rain drumming on the roof like a countdown she didn't want to acknowledge. Sterling knew exactly what he was doing. The message wasn't subtle. I know who you are. I know where you came from. And I'm going to use it. Sterling's campaign against her didn't start loud. It started with paperwork. The first file landed on her desk at 6:27 a.m., before the day shift formally began. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession, each one marked with a sticky note in Sterling's precise handwriting, chart review incomplete. Medication discrepancy. Improper patient notation. The stack grew throughout the week like a prosecutor's case file. Danielle photographed each one mentally before placing them in the designated folder. She didn't argue. She didn't ask Sterling to explain the discrepancies, she knew exactly what this was. The files were legitimate enough to survive scrutiny, vague enough to justify removal. A chess player moving pieces into position, testing how far he could advance before she reacted. But she didn't react. She simply worked. 12-hour shifts became 14. She stayed after clocking out to verify every notation, every dosage, every timestamp. The charts were correct. They were always correct. Yet Sterling kept fabricating reasons to summon her to his office, his voice moving through stages of manufactured concern. These mistakes, Danielle, they concern me. For patient safety, of course. His office smelled like expensive cologne and the antiseptic sting of someone who'd never touched a patient themselves. Perhaps nursing wasn't your background before? Your references are sparse. She met his eyes with the kind of calm that made predators nervous. One measured breath. A single tear escaped, not from fear but from the weight of being hunted by someone half as competent as he believed. She wiped it without breaking contact. My work speaks for itself, Doctor. He smiled, disappointed that his verbal jab hadn't landed harder. We'll see. The humiliation escalated during shift change on a Tuesday. The nursing station was full, all 8 of them clustered around the assignment board, checking patient loads for the incoming night shift. Sterling approached like a man walking into a board meeting he'd already won. Nurses, he announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. I've been thinking about the retention rates among our recent hires. Statistically, the first 3 months are critical. Some people simply don't have what it takes. The room stilled. Everyone recognized the setup. In fact, I'd like to place a small wager. Danielle, how long do you think you'll actually last here? He turned to face her directly, smile sharp as a blade catching light. I'm betting you walk out within a week. Anyone want the other side of that action? One nurse laughed. Another looked at the floor. Nobody took the bet. That's what I thought, Sterling said. Danielle's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She simply continued reviewing the patient assignment for bed for C, reading the vitals and history as though he'd asked about the weather. I'm not a statistical anomaly, doctor. I'm a nurse. The words landed softly. Devastatingly. His smile tightened. He'd expected either tears or anger, something he could use, something he could document. Instead, he'd gotten quiet dignity, and it made him look small in front of his audience. The second public humiliation came 3 days later. Danielle was reviewing discharge papers at the nurse's station during the 2:13 p.m. handoff when Sterling materialized beside her like an unwanted thought. This time he had an audience again, 2 residents and a nursing supervisor all within earshot. Ms. Ross, I wanted to follow up on your employment verification. I've been reviewing your resume, and there are some gaps I can't quite reconcile. She set down her pen. Turned to face him fully. So, your previous employers. The ones listed before you came to us. His voice carried the false concern of a man reading from a script. I had our HR contact them this morning. Interesting thing, none of them have records of you working there. Not anywhere. It's almost as if the employment history is fabricated. The residents exchanged glances. The supervisor's eyes widened. That's not possible, one resident said quietly. Sterling raised a hand. I'm simply saying that credentials should be verifiable. And hers aren't. The question becomes, what else isn't real? He looked at Danielle directly, voice dropping to something more dangerous. You came here to disappear, didn't you? Running from something. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical drone. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Danielle breathed in through her nose, antiseptic, the faint copper of old blood in the air circulation, the stale coffee from the break room, and let it settle in her chest. She thought of Helmand Province at dawn, of the weight of a child in her arms, of the exact moment she decided to become someone no one would ever know. She met his eyes. Let him see nothing. My nursing license is current, doctor. That's what matters. But even as she said it, she knew the clock had started. Sterling had laid the trap with precision. The fabricated disciplinary issues weren't actually about termination, they were about creating a paper trail, establishing a pattern, building a case that would stand up to scrutiny. He was orchestrating something larger, something that required institutional machinery. He was calling in favors, activating networks, preparing to erase her the way he'd tried to humiliate her. She should have walked that moment. Should have gotten on a bus to somewhere else, another city, another hospital, another name. Instead, she finished the shift. And then she cleaned the supply closet that hadn't needed cleaning in weeks, restocking the crash carts, checking ventilators, preparing equipment that might save lives. The call came through the intercom at 2:38 a.m. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 1. All hands. Danielle was moving before her brain finished processing the words. The ER erupted from silence into chaos, the sound of wheels screaming against tile, multiple voices overlapping, the percussion of equipment being wheeled into position. The ambulance doors burst open to reveal a young man on a stretcher, his chest heaving in rapid, desperate gasps. The paramedic was shouting vitals, respiratory distress, tension pneumothorax suspected, breath sounds absent on left, tracheal deviation, we're losing him. Sterling was already there, which meant the hospital had called the surgeon. He stepped into the bay with the confidence of someone who'd never once doubted his own decisions. Get him to imaging. We need a CT before we. No time, Danielle said. Not a question. Not a request. The words came out in a different register than anyone had ever heard from her. He's crashing. You can't get him to imaging if he's dead. Sterling turned to her with the kind of contempt reserved for people who questioned authority. I'm aware of the protocol, nurse. We wait for confirmation. The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. 72. 68. The ventilator couldn't compensate against a collapsed lung and a tension pneumothorax compressing his heart. Every second they debated was a second he wasn't breathing. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. Danielle's fingers found the landmarks on his ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times because she had. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. Pure, sudden pressure relief. The monitors shifted almost immediately. Oxygen saturation began climbing. 75. 80. 88. Stable. The entire trauma bay froze. Nurses, residents, the attending surgeon who'd rushed in from upstairs, all of them stared at Danielle's hands, which had just performed an emergency procedure with the kind of muscle memory that didn't come from nursing school. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. But Danielle barely noticed him. Her eyes had locked on the patient's neck, on a small dark birthmark positioned just below his left ear. She'd seen that birthmark before. 20 years ago, in a different country, in a different lifetime. It had belonged to an 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from the rubble of a collapsed school in Helmand Province while mortar fire turned the daylight into something that smelled like copper and burning diesel. She looked at his face properly for the first time. Recognition hit her like a breech charge. The child's features had matured into a man's, strengthened by time and discipline and the particular hardness that came from swearing an oath to something larger than yourself. But the eyes were the same. The jawline was the same. The same boy. Now a warrior. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation holding at 91. Heart rate normalizing. The needle decompression had bought him time, had bought him life. And what happened in the next 72 hours would change everything. The monitors screamed first. Then the alarms. It was 2:56 a.m. when Commander Mitchell's oxygen saturation plummeted, the steady beep of the pulse oximeter accelerating into a frantic wail that cut through Mercy General's trauma bay like incoming fire. Danielle was restocking the forecart when the second alarm joined the first, a deep sustained tone from the ventilator, the sound of a machine fighting a patient who couldn't breathe anymore. She moved toward the bay without thinking, her body already reading the crisis before her mind caught up. Mitchell lay pale against the white sheets, his chest rising and falling in shallow panicked gasps. His eyes were wide, the kind of wide that meant he knew something was wrong, that his military training recognized the signature of oxygen deprivation in his own blood. The nurses clustered around him, checking lines, adjusting settings, their movements efficient but unfocused. They were reacting without direction, each one waiting for someone to take command. Dr. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed with his arms folded. Watching. Not moving. We need respiratory down here, one of the nurses called out, her voice tight. We need a surgeon. Sterling didn't look up from his phone. The surgeon is 17 minutes out. We wait. Danielle stepped into the bay. She could see the signs written across Mitchell's body like a combat medic's triage notation, the way his neck veins were distended, the uneven rise and fall of his chest wall, the desperate work of muscles that shouldn't have to fight this hard to draw breath. A tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing on his heart, crushing it with every second they delayed. She'd seen it twice in Helmand Province, both times in the field where decisions had to be made in the space between heartbeats, where hesitation meant body bags and letters home. Doctor, his O2 saturation is 68, Danielle said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. It never shook anymore. Tracheal deviation. We need a needle decompression. Now. Sterling's eyes flicked toward her, annoyed. I'm aware of what we need, nurse. We are waiting for 63, another nurse announced. The panic in her voice was rising, climbing the same curve as Mitchell's metabolic descent. 62. The room tilted. Not the room. The trauma bay in Helmand. Dust on the floor. The smell of diesel and copper and cordite. A boy with his legs pinned under concrete blocks, his lungs filling with his own blood while she had no chest tube, no operating theater, nothing but a combat medic's knife and the kind of desperation that makes you believe you can carve a path to survival. She could hear the Taliban fighters shouting outside the compound. Could hear the return fire punching through the walls. Could feel her hands moving through procedures she'd trained for but never thought she'd have to execute in a crumbling schoolhouse with a 7-year-old gasping like a landed fish. 58, the nurse whispered. Danielle was already moving. Her hands reached for the 14-gauge angiocath needle in the crash cart, her fingers finding it the way a guitarist finds the right string without looking. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She'd done this once in actual combat. Once in 6 years of active service. Not in a hospital. Not with a full trauma team watching her with suspended belief. But the hands that had held lives together in Helmand Province still remembered the angles, the pressure, the exact moment you'd feel the give of the pleural space and know you'd done it right. What are you doing? Sterling's voice. Weak. He was losing his audience and he knew it. Danielle didn't answer. She'd already prepped Mitchell's chest, the antiseptic cold against her fingers, the landmarks of his anatomy appearing in her mind like coordinates on a military map. She could feel his ribs beneath her touch, the geography of his body translating into the only language that mattered right now, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, heart-keeping rhythm, brain staying conscious. You don't have authorization. She pushed the needle through the skin. Through the intercostal muscles. She felt the pop, the subtle give of resistance breaking like a seal, and then the hiss. A thin bright hiss of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a lung re-expanding, the sound of a man remembering how to breathe. The entire hospital stopped. Nobody moved. The nurses at the bedside froze mid-movement. 2 residents standing in the doorway stood so still they might have been cast in bronze. Through the trauma bay windows, Danielle could see faces, nurses from the ICU, a night shift surgeon grabbing coffee in the hallway, an orderly who'd wheeled Mitchell in just 6 hours ago. They'd all stopped. All watching. All understanding in the space of that single hiss that something fundamental had just shifted in Mercy General's careful hierarchy. Mitchell gasped. Actually gasped, the kind of breath that fills lungs instead of scraping against empty passages. His hand reached up toward Danielle's arm and she let him grip it, his fingers finding the calluses there, the evidence of work that had nothing to do with hospital corners or med-pass rounds. O2 sat climbing, the nurse said. Her voice had changed. No longer panicked. Clinical now. 68. 72. 78. Danielle's other hand was steady on the needle, keeping it in place, making sure the air stayed free to escape and the lung stayed expanded. This was the difference between a moment and a procedure. Between luck and precision. She could feel 30 years of her own survival compressed into this single gesture, the quiet authority that comes from having already stared into the space where dying happens and chosen not to go there. 84, the nurse continued. 88. 92. Mitchell's eyes cleared. The panic glaze receding like a tide going out. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way someone looks at a person who's just pulled them out of the dark. His hand was still gripping her arm. Stable, the nurse said. Sterling had moved to the corner of the trauma bay. His mouth was open slightly, the expression of a man who'd just watched his perfect, carefully constructed authority dissolve in the space of one procedure. He turned and walked out without a word. The door closed behind him with the finality of a verdict. Danielle secured the needle with tape, her movements precise and controlled, every action deliberate and exact. The kind of competence that doesn't need to announce itself. One of the residents in the doorway was whispering something to the other. She caught the words field dressing and emergency protocol, and where did she learn that? The kind of terminology that didn't belong on a hospital floor. The kind that made people ask questions they didn't know how to ask yet. A text message lit up on the trauma monitor someone had set down nearby. The words visible for just a moment: formal complaint filed. Authorization violations. Disciplinary investigation initiated effective immediately. From Sterling's office email address to the hospital's personnel department. Timestamp 2:51 a.m. Sent 4 minutes ago while the entire floor was watching her save a Marine commander's life. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling's hands moved fast. Very fast. Before the trauma bay doors even swung closed, he was in the physician's lounge, phone pressed to his ear. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Less than that. A favor here. A name dropped there. 3 board members on speed dial. The kind of connections that don't appear in any hospital directory, the ones built on 18 years of understanding exactly what people wanted and knowing how to deliver it. He wasn't worried about Mitchell. Mitchell was a Marine. Marines survived things. What Sterling needed was Danielle gone before she started pulling threads on the billing contracts, the supply chain kickbacks, the $847,000 in inflated charges he'd been running with Meridian Medical for the past 14 months. She had the kind of discipline that made people actually read charts. The kind of mind that noticed when numbers didn't align. That was a problem. By 11:27 p.m., he'd already made the calls. 3 board members confirmed they owed him favors. By 6:13 a.m. the next morning, he'd brought in Dr. Patricia Hands, an outside investigator from a firm in Durham, the type of person who asked the right questions and didn't care what the answers meant. Sterling had given her one directive: validate that Danielle's employment history didn't exist. That her references were fabricated. That she was running some kind of con. The problem was that Danielle's references weren't fabricated. They just weren't real anymore. Fort Bragg had closed the medical records office she'd supposedly worked at in 2009. The clinic in Lejeune where she'd supposedly trained didn't exist under that name anymore. They'd merged it with another facility. She'd been careful, methodical, building a past that could technically exist but couldn't actually be verified. Just like a ghost builds a footprint that vanishes when you look for it too closely. But Danielle hadn't anticipated someone like Sterling. Someone desperate. Someone willing to spend money and burn favors just to bury a nurse. By 2:38 p.m. on day 2, the investigator had her report ready. Employment history inconsistent. References unverifiable. Credentials under question. Not fraudulent, not technically. Just unreliable. Just enough to suggest something was wrong. By 4:22 p.m. that same day, Sterling walked into Danielle's small workstation in the ICU corridor. She was documenting vital signs on Commander Mitchell's chart, her handwriting precise and steady. Mitchell's oxygen saturation was 96% now. His lung was re-inflating. The needle decompression had held. Everything about her work was textbook perfect. Danielle. Sterling's voice carried the tone of a man delivering a decision that had already been made. We need to talk. My office. She didn't look up from the chart. Just closed it and stood. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a 14-hour shift. A smear of betadine stained her left sleeve from when she'd prepped Mitchell's chest. Her badge hung slightly crooked, the way it always did. The office was cold. Hospital offices always were. Sterling sat behind his desk. He didn't ask her to sit. She remained standing, hands at her sides, the same posture she'd held through cafeteria humiliation and chart throwing. The same stillness that had driven him to fury because it meant nothing was breaking. Your employment history has some significant gaps, he said. We've had an independent investigator review your credentials. I understand. Your references don't check out, Danielle. Some of them don't even exist. She held his gaze. One measured breath. The fluorescent light above his desk hummed its flat electric song. Rain began tapping against the window behind him, the first real rain in 3 days, fat drops hitting glass like fingertips testing a locked door. "I've been doing this work for 3 months," she said. Her voice was even. Conversational. "My record here is documented. Your record here is also reckless." Sterling leaned forward. "You performed a procedure yesterday without authorization. You violated protocol. You acted on your own authority. I saved his life." "That's not the point." Sterling's face was flushing now, a dull red creeping up his neck. He'd expected her to defend herself. To explain. To crack. Instead, she was answering with facts. With absolute certainty. With the kind of calm that made men like him feel like they were the ones losing control. "The point is that we have no verification of your training. No way to confirm you're actually qualified to work here. For all we know, you could be anyone." Danielle didn't move. Didn't speak. Just held his eyes with the weight of someone who'd already survived worse than this. Much worse. Effective immediately, you were terminated. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Your credentials are under review. You're not authorized to practice nursing at Mercy General or any hospital in this state until the investigation concludes. Security will escort you from the building. She turned to leave. "That's it," Sterling called after her, his voice rising. "No argument? No tears?" Danielle paused at the door. Turned back. Looked at him with the kind of composure that only came from having already lost everything once before. "No, doctor. Just a terminated employee." The escort was professional. Silent. Danielle cleared her locker in 11 minutes. The cracked coffee mug went into the cardboard box first, a relic from a deployment to Fallujah where someone had thrown it at a wall and she'd kept it anyway as a reminder that broken things could still hold something. The dying succulent followed. Then a photograph in a frame, the edges worn from being held too many times. 8 soldiers in desert camouflage, dustcoat, sunburned. The faces of people who weren't coming home. The faces of people who depended on her to keep them alive, and who had learned too late that keeping people alive wasn't the same as keeping them safe. She didn't reach for the combat boots. They remained in the back of her locker, hidden beneath a spare pair of scrubs, their leather creased from 20 years of use. The soles were worn smooth from 1,000 miles of patrols through Helmand province, from running across collapsing school buildings, from standing in the dust while 8-year-old boys stared at her with eyes too old for their faces. Those boots were the only tangible proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever existed. That she'd been anyone other than just a nurse. The rain had intensified by the time security walked her to the main entrance. The kind of rain that came sideways, driven by wind, that soaked through fabric in seconds. She stood outside the sliding doors for a moment, the cardboard box growing heavier in her hands as the rain absorbed into the cardboard, making it soft and collapsing. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. She could see it from the parking lot, a small shelter with a bench and a route map no one ever consulted. She walked toward it with the box held against her chest, rain streaming down her face, mixing with something that might have been tears or might have been just the weather. It was hard to tell anymore. Everything felt like survival now. Just moving forward because stopping wasn't an option. The bench was wet. She sat down anyway. The cardboard box was falling apart. She carefully removed the photograph and held it close to her chest, shielding it from the rain. The mug was waterlogged. The succulent was drowning. 3 months at Mercy General Hospital. 11 minutes to pack. 12 years of military service disappearing behind her like she'd never worn the uniform at all. She could go home. Call her mother. Tell her that her daughter, the one she'd raised to be tough, to be unstoppable, had broken somewhere in the dust and never quite put herself back together. That the quiet life she'd built in Raleigh, the anonymity she'd been so careful to construct, had been an illusion. A fantasy that a person could just disappear into normalcy and forget the weight of the lives she couldn't save. A woman with an umbrella passed the bus stop, glancing at Danielle with a kind of pity that came from seeing someone sitting in the rain with wet cardboard. She slowed, hesitated, started to offer the umbrella. Danielle shook her head. The woman kept walking. She pulled the photograph closer and stared at the faces again. The one in the middle was hers, younger, sun-darkened, with the kind of eyes that hadn't yet learned what they were capable of. The others were people who'd learned that lesson in permanent ways. People whose names she still said aloud sometimes, late at night in her apartment, to make sure they hadn't been completely forgotten. The rain kept falling. 2:51 a.m. on a Thursday night at a bus stop on West Martin Street in Raleigh, North Carolina, with a cardboard box falling apart and a photograph that was the last piece of proof that any of it had been real. No medical license. No nursing career. No quiet life. No identity. Just a woman in wet scrubs, sitting in the rain, counting the ways she'd failed to stay invisible. She reached into the box and pulled out what was left of the succulent. It was dead. Had been dead for a week. She'd been watering it out of habit, not hope. She held it for a moment, considering dropping it into the gutter, letting the rain finish what neglect had started. Then she heard it. Faint at first. A distant sound, rhythmic and low, growing louder. Not a car. Not an ambulance. The unmistakable thud-thud-thud of rotor blades cutting through rain-heavy air. Getting closer. Moving toward the hospital that was only 4 blocks away. Danielle didn't move. She kept the dead plant in her hand and waited for the sound to pass. But it didn't pass. The helicopter rotors shook the building so hard that the fluorescent lights flickered in their fixtures, casting the hallway in strobing shadows. Danielle sat at the bus stop 12 blocks away when the sound rolled across Raleigh like distant thunder. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Whatever was happening at Mercy General no longer concerned a nurse with a cardboard box and a bus pass. The cracked mug shifted inside the box. The dying succulent soil spilled onto the photograph beneath it. She wiped the dirt from the faces of her platoon with 2 fingers and didn't feel anything anymore. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She watched it vibrate against the wet bench for 6 seconds before answering. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. Not a question. A voice that had seen command authority from 1,000 feet in the air. This is Lieutenant Commander Graves, 160th SAW. We have an emergency at Mercy General that requires your presence immediately. I'm not a service member anymore. That's not what your medical file says, We'll have transport there in 4 minutes. The line went dead. Danielle stared at her phone. For minutes. The rain continued hammering. She picked up her box and walked back toward the hospital, boots splashing through puddles that reflected the helicopter descending toward the roof in perfect military precision. The parking lot erupted with activity when she arrived. Medical personnel scattered as the rotors pushed rain sideways. She moved against the crowd, cardboard box still in her hands, walking through the chaos with the same deliberate pace she'd maintained when leaving the building hours before. The ER doors hissed open. Sterling was already at the nurse's station, his face flushed with something that looked like panic. Dr. Sterling. Her voice hadn't changed. Still the quiet nurse. Still deferential. Still someone he'd already erased from the building. Where's the emergency? He looked at her like she was a ghost. You're not authorized to be here. Security. Move. The word dropped like a stone into still water. It wasn't loud. It was just absolute. A former Taliban fighter stumbled out of the elevator with 2 orderlies supporting him, blood soaking through gauze at his abdomen. Danielle's hands moved before her brain registered what came next. 30 years of memory compressed into 1 fraction of a second. She knew that face. She'd seen it through an infrared scope from a ridge in Sanjin Valley. She'd watched this man's compound burn in 2003. She'd pulled 12 children from the basement while rounds tore through the structure around her. His eyes found hers. Recognition bloomed across his features like a wound opening. He shouted something in Pashto. The words tumbled out like gravel in a blender, something about the devil woman, something about Helmand, something about a ghost he thought he'd died at. Orderly stepped back. Staff froze. Commander Mitchell stood up from the waiting room where he'd been holding a cold pack to his shoulder. The movement was slow and deliberate, the kind of stance that commands attention without raising a voice. "You will address Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross with respect," he said to the man on the stretcher. Not a request. A statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who had authority and knew how to use it. The former fighter's face drained to grey. Danielle set her cardboard box on a chair and walked to Trauma Bay 3 without looking back. 3 people came with her. The wounded man was on the stretcher, whimpering now, the fight gone out of him like air from a punctured lung. His abdomen had a single puncture wound, clean entry, probably 7 millimeters. Knife work. Precision. Someone had done this to him on purpose. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, 2 liters of normal saline running wide open, and a surgical tray." Her voice sounded different now. Not the nurse's voice. Something older. Something that had given orders on battlefields with bullets in the air. Now. Move. The nurses moved. She was reading his chart when Mitchell appeared in the doorway. His presence filled the space like a shadow cast by something immense. He held a piece of paper in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he extended it toward her. Not from fear. From something that looked like gratitude so enormous it couldn't fit inside his body. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice." Danielle read the handwritten note at the bottom of his medical file. It was his handwriting, careful and deliberate. It read, "Please find a way to thank Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross for saving my life twice. Once when I was 8 years old in Helmand Province. Once when I was 36 years old here at Mercy General. I would be dead without her courage." The tremor in her chest wasn't fear. It was restraint. Control. The act of not letting 15 years of silence shatter in front of witnesses. A man in desert camouflage stepped into the bay behind Mitchell. His uniform bore the insignia of SEAL Team 3. His eyes were the color of storm clouds. He looked at Danielle the way you look at something you've been searching for and thought was lost. "Senior Chief," he said. His voice was gravel compressed into human form. "I'm Lieutenant Jake Holloway, Charlie Platoon. I just read your classified ops file. Need to get this on record." Sterling appeared in the doorway behind him, his color fluctuating between white and crimson like a failing heart monitor. She's not authorized, I have documentation." Holloway didn't acknowledge him. He turned to Danielle and spoke clearly enough that every person in the trauma bay could hear each word as its own distinct statement. 2 bronze stars for courage under fire. Silver star for single-handedly extracting 6 hostages from an insurgent strongpoint. 2 purple hearts for wounds sustained in combat operations. He paused. The silence stretched like wire pulled tight. And a Navy Cross. For valor in combat. Classified until this moment. For Operation Desert Hawk in Helmand Province. For saving the lives of 12 civilians. Including 1 child who is now a Marine Corps commander. The room held its breath. Sterling's hands were shaking. His jaw worked without producing sound. His eyes darted between Danielle and the SEAL team leader, calculating, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Danielle never looked at him. She kept her eyes on the man bleeding on the stretcher, on Mitchell standing in the doorway like a guardian made flesh, on Holloway whose respect manifested as the kind of stillness you only earned by surviving impossible things. "I need him in surgery," Danielle said. "Get him to OR 3. Push another liter now. His BP is dropping." She turned back to the monitor. It beeped its mechanical rhythm. 78, 82, 85. The numbers climbing. Steady. The kind of steady that came from hands that had held lives together in worse circumstances than a hospital trauma bay. It was Holloway who first heard the FBI agents before anyone else in the building knew they were coming. He moved to the hallway and spoke quietly into his phone for 6 seconds, then disconnected. Sterling had already started walking toward the back exit. He didn't get far. 2 agents in dark suits appeared at the end of the corridor. One of them was carrying a folder thick enough to contain a life's worth of evidence. They moved with the kind of purpose that said someone had been very thorough with discovery. Dr. Alan Sterling, the agent said. Her badge caught the fluorescent light. We have a warrant for your arrest related to healthcare fraud, insurance manipulation, and falsification of medical personnel records. You have the right to remain silent. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound like a door closing on something that couldn't be opened again. The agent read him his rights in a voice that had done this same speech 200 times and would do it 200 more before retirement. Sterling walked past the cafeteria. Past the nurse's station. Past the exact spot where he knocked her tray from her hands 14 days ago and told her to pick it up. His colleagues watched. No one looked away. No one spoke. Their silence was more damning than any accusation could have been. The perp walk made the evening news. 6 cameras caught him leaving the building, handcuffs visible, his suit wrinkled, his face the color of something that had died already. The headline ran for 2 days, Mercy General Physician arrested in $847,000 insurance fraud scheme. It was the secondary headline that stayed with Danielle, decorated Navy veteran cleared of misconduct charges. She was back in the ER the next morning in fresh scrubs, moving between beds like she'd never left. Her badge was clipped back to her collar. Her access card worked again. The looks from the staff were different now, though. No pity. No dismissal. Just respect and the kind of curiosity that comes from realizing you'd been standing next to someone extraordinary without recognizing it. 6 months later, a photograph arrived in her mailbox with no return address. It showed Dr. Sterling, no longer wearing a suit, standing behind a folding table in a parking lot. The name tag on his shirt read, Steve. He was selling cut-rate insurance policies to people who couldn't afford better. His hands were shaking. His eyes had the look of someone who'd been stripped of everything that told him who he was and couldn't quite remember how to exist without those labels. Danielle stared at the photograph for exactly 5 seconds, then placed it in recycling. She had better things to do. The hospital board called a meeting. A new wing was being constructed, Department of Veteran Services, with pro bono care for active duty military and their families. They offered Danielle the position of Director of Emergency Services. Chief of the entire trauma department. Command authority over 16 physicians and 43 nurses. She accepted. Not because of the title. But because Mitchell and Holloway had asked her to. Because there were kids coming home from Kandahar and Mosul who needed someone who understood what it meant to carry wounds nobody could see. Because the quiet life she'd built to protect herself wasn't enough anymore. On her first day in the new position, she walked to her office and placed something on the shelf behind her desk. A shadow box made of mahogany, lined with black felt. Inside, carefully preserved, were the combat boots she'd worn through 17 years of service. The leather was cracked. The heels were worn thin. The laces were still wrapped the way she'd left them in Helmand Province 2 decades ago. She stood in front of the shadow box for 2 minutes without moving. Mitchell appeared in her doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He didn't say anything. Just sat down beside her and drank his coffee while she stared at those boots, at the physical evidence of who she'd been, at the scars that mapped a geography nobody could navigate except someone who'd walked the same terrain. "Thank you," he said. "Finally. For getting me out. For getting all of us out." "I'm a nurse," Danielle said. "That's what we do." "No." His voice was steady as a pulse. "That's what you do." She turned back to her desk, back to her files, back to the work. But the boots stayed in the shadow box. Not hidden anymore. Not in some locker at the bottom of a dark closet. Right there on the shelf where everyone could see. Right there where the truth of her could be observed by anyone who walked into her office. A nurse with a Navy Cross. A healer who'd been forged in fire. A quiet person who'd stopped trying to disappear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The act of holding back everything she'd learned about strength while she went about the work of saving lives in the ordinary minutes of an ordinary hospital, one patient at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of quiet authority at a time. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.